Okay, let's get into this next bit. The United States of America, our country, after World War II, second half of the Cold War, with a real focus on the second half of the Cold War. All right, and from 1945 to 1970, the U.S. followed the policies um, that were brought to the country by FDR. Remember, Harry Truman was vice president to Franklin Roosevelt. So when you have 12 years of Roosevelt and then 8 years of Truman, it's really a similar policy being pushed. President Dwight Eisenhower was very middle of the road, although a Republican, breaking from the Democratic 20 years of Democratic rule. He's not going to veer much from the Truman, or I'm sorry, the FDR Truman policies. They continue to increase things like government help of the old, unemployed, the rich. They continue to embrace the rise of the power of unions and continue to embrace things like high taxes on the rich to pay for everything the government does. Truman does the interstate highway program, which brings freeways to our country. America is booming during these years. During this period, the amount of money that people in the U.S. made went up about 3% every year, which is really big. And the U.S. becomes the world's leader economically. One reason was because the U.S. was the only industrial country that didn't need to rebuild after the war, right? So you're Germany, you're Britain, you're France, you're Russia, you're Japan, their countries were all in shambles. And they were busy trying to rebuild their country from shambles, which gave them a great opportunity, created a lot of jobs. But if you're going to buy now the stuff you need to rebuild, your metal goods, your woods, your lumber, your concrete, and then eventually your appliances, your cars, okay, big one there, cars, electronics, you're going to buy it from America. America was the only store that was open in town that made that stuff. You're not worried about your auto industry when half of your buildings are laying on the ground. You're going to rebuild those buildings first. So America has a massive economic boom. 50s and 60s are an amazing time economically for the U.S. There was still this Cold War competition, and in the 1950s, politician Joseph McCarthy takes advantage of this. He scares people, and he starts calling out people as being communists. There was that fear of communism, of nuclear war, and he plays on it, and he starts to name government workers, movie stars, scholars, university professors that he claims were communist. Did some of these people maybe believe in socialist ideas? Sure. So did Franklin Roosevelt, okay? Socialist ideas are not evil. They think government should do more, right? But oftentimes the people whose names were on these lists became social outcasts. Many actors, directors, producers never worked again in Hollywood. Many government workers lost their jobs. And some people will call this the period of blacklisting people. In 1953, McCarthy starts accusing army officials of being communist, and quickly everyone says, oh, that guy, that's right, he's a quack. Don't listen to him. He's a fool. And McCarthyism ends a few years after it began, but it did really kind of destroy a lot of people's lives. This is a Hollywood 10. These are just regular old actors who thought that the government should probably maybe be doing more for the people. Somehow were connected to socialism and lost everything. In 1960, we got a president named John F. Kennedy, youngest elected president ever. Teddy Roosevelt was younger, but he took over when he was vice president and William McKinley was assassinated. Kennedy pushes policies that kind of continue the Franklin Roosevelt system of belief. Interestingly, both Roosevelt and Kennedy were rich guys that came from families that had political backgrounds. From the Northeast, he's from Massachusetts, and he said, look, the government should do more for people. He believed in things like more help Medicaid, right? So Medicare and Medicaid, money, health insurance for the old and free health insurance for low-income individuals. 3 years later, John F. Kennedy was shot to death while on a parade in a convertible in Dallas, Texas. Last president to be assassinated was John Kennedy. John Kennedy's vice president was a guy named Lyndon Johnson, who was from Texas. And instead of kind of pushing his policies, the policies that he had always preached as a Texas senator, he decided he was going to respect Kennedy's legacy and push Kennedy's policies. To that end, he advances policies like Medicare, Medicaid, free health insurance for people over 65 or greatly reduced. Same thing, greatly reduced health insurance for low-income individuals, many of whom are these same people over 65 who are living on Social Security. And he also passes things like the Civil Rights Act, which Kennedy was a big supporter of civil rights. Kennedy was known for working with Martin Luther King, or having support from Martin Luther King. And Lyndon Johnson will work with Martin Luther King to get the Civil Rights Act passed, the Voting Rights Act passed, laws that guaranteed African Americans rights in a time when the laws were against African Americans. And now we're going to talk about that civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X we talked about in the 1910s and 20s, there were two sides to the movement, right? There was the moderate side, W.B. Du Bois, and then the more strict side, the Back to Africa movement by Marcus Garvey. Had a moment there. This is the same kind of thing, right? We have Martin Luther King, nonviolent protest, Malcolm X, Black Panthers, equality through any means necessary. And they're going to work not together, but kind of in unison to advance civil rights of African Americans. Because the bottom line is, folks, that when slavery ended, equality didn't just show up in America. The truth of the matter is that equality was a long, hard-fought battle. That after the Civil War in the late 1800s in the southeastern slave states, they passed a series of laws culminating in the 1896 law, Plessy versus Ferguson, but there was a bunch of laws before that limited the rights of African Americans. These were openly, in-your-face, racist laws. This is the period of segregation in the United States. And it should be known that during the Cold War, during this period, the Soviet Union would oftentimes cite U.S. segregation and openly racist policies as reasons why America just wasn't all that great. How great of a country can it be that has different laws for different people, depending on the color of their skin? This was propaganda that was used in Russia to try and, again, show that America didn't really follow through in the claims that it made, the claims of greatness that America had always made. Maybe they had a point. So we talk about Plessy Ferguson, separate schools, bathrooms, drinking fountains, housing, ride in the back of the bus. These things were not equal. Black people couldn't go to the swimming pool that white people went to, the community pool. The black schools were not as nice as the white schools. And, everything was unequal. In 1954, the Supreme Court, Rosa Parks in 1956 decided, and here's Rosa Parks, American hero, that she was not going to give up her seat in the bus. She was actually, really look into it, sitting in the back of the bus anyways, in the black section, but a white man, what kind of manners is that, comes back and says, "Get out of your seat, I want it." She says, "No, in the back already. Um, and she gets arrested for it. We then have the Montgomery bus boycott. Martin Luther King shows up on the scene, makes a very famous speech. And for over a year, African Americans in Montgomery refused to ride the bus, which hurt the bus. Finally, the Supreme Court declared that segregation should not be legal. The actual Supreme Court case was called Brown v. Board of Education. This was about a school that was an African American girl who's lived in an area where she should go to the white school, but they weren't allowing her. It's crazy the things that would happen back then. They would have like just random people show up, like white people, and they would like yell at her because she wants to go to the school down the street from her. I mean, it's really kind of mind blowing for me. But all of this begins to change in the 50s. In 1963, Martin Luther King leads a million-man march to Washington, D.C., where he gives his famous I Have a Dream speech. He followed Gandhi's nonviolent protest policies. In 65, here in LA, there are race riots that break out. And I want to take this moment, if I may, to talk about racism in LA. Because everyone's always like, yeah, Deep South, that's where the segregation laws were. Yeah, it's true. The former slave states, the Southeast part of this country, is where most of the segregation laws existed. And people want to, especially people I know who grew up around here, there wasn't racism here, there wasn't segregation here. Really? Let me show you something. All right, let's get real, folks. I am a SoCal kid, born and raised, 818, represent. Burbank, California, North Hollywood, right? Although I was born in Tarzana. And my grandpa was a cop, and he'd be like, yeah. I'd be like, well, you always talk to your grandpa about things. You ask him questions. What was it like to be a cop? All right, so anyway, my grandpa was a cop, Burbank. And you always ask your grandpa a bunch of questions. He had an interesting job. He'd be like, you ever shoot anyone? No, what's the worst part about the job? Paperwork. But then one time he had said to me, the worst thing about the job really was when I had to escort Black people out of town after dark. I was a kid, My grandpa was a great guy. Shout out Joseph Norris, Burbank Police. And I didn't get it. You don't get it when you're a kid. It wasn't until I got into college and I started studying about this thing called sundown towns that I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, my grandpa said that. Because, these cities here, let's take my hometown of Burbank, 818, Black people were not allowed in town after dark. How do we know this? Well, here's an old ordinance. City of Burbank and Glendale prohibits, I don't use that word, Black people from remaining inside the municipal limits after sundown. My grandpa used to escort them to North Hollywood. I didn't get it. I was a kid. Look at the numbers of census numbers. 90,000 people, 29 were Black. And I think that these were like servants and stuff. Here's firsthand accounts about how Black man, worked at Lockheed and after dark, he was forced to go home. Or even into the 60s, Black people weren't allowed to stay in these cities after the dark. And again, the census records are just factual. These may be more firsthand kind of accounts, but no portion of this tract shall ever at any time be used or occupied by anyone but white people. But I thought segregation didn't exist in LA. I thought we were too good for that. Right? Let's have some fun with this one. It's not fun. What other places shall we look up? I don't know. Let's look up places near us. don't think Hidden Hills was even around back then. Yeah, it's not. There. Inglewood. Inglewood. Always up to no good, right? What? Inglewood was a sundown town? In 1960? Black people couldn't buy houses in Inglewood? No black people were allowed on their own property in the area of Inglewood. Look at the census numbers. Inglewood. Wait a minute. Not Compton. Not the CPT. What? No black people could own land in Compton before World War II. It wasn't until the 60s that Compton started to get desegregated. Let's keep looking. Manhattan Beach? What? Love Manhattan Beach. The OC? That a whole county? That a whole county? There was a 1963 Proposition 14 that was a Forced Housing Act. Glendale, 1960. 62 black people in Glendale. In the northern part of town, in the valley, really, you guys, it was segregated. I hate to say it. Yuck. No information from Tarzana. That's us, right? Woodland Hills and up there. Segregation existed outside of the Deep South. Segregation existed in my hometown of Burbank. Tough pill to swallow. All those people I know, like my mom, my aunts and uncles, they grew up in a segregated society. All of their friends, everyone they knew. Kind of explains a lot, actually. In 1968, Martin Luther King was killed by a guy named James Earl Ray. That's 7 years before I was born. 7 years is a really short amount of time. I didn't even realize it growing up. It seemed like so far away. The Black Panthers, by peace through any means necessary. Malcolm X started off as a Black Panther. He starts to agree with Martin Luther King. Interesting story about Malcolm X. He goes to Mecca, which is the center of the Islamic faith around the world, and Malcolm X is Islamic. He got there and he saw white people there. He was like, what? He starts talking to people. He says, yeah, we're all brothers. It doesn't matter about the color of our skin. Our religion binds us together. And he comes back and he's kind of not as militaristic. And then he's killed by a Black Panther who's mad at him, or someone from the Nation of Islam, maybe, who wanted him to stay more militaristic. We have people like Lou Alcindor, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, all-time NBA leader in points, changing to Islam and trying to embrace his past. Cassius Clay, rope-a-dope. Muhammad Ali changed his name, greatest boxer ever, to try and say, hey, why do I have these English names, slave names? I should have more of a name that has to do with my cultural past. Movement during that period. Briefly, we'll quickly go through here. In the late 60s, a guy named Richard Nixon becomes president, largely as a result of anti-war protests. And he gets busted in 1972 because someone who worked for him, not him, plants listening devices in the Democratic headquarters in a hotel called Watergate. they get caught red-handed by his maintenance guy. And instead of admitting that it was his people who hired those people, he probably would have lost the election, but he wouldn't have been disgraced. He hides it. And for 2 years, he hides it. Eventually, they find out he knew, and he has to resign in disgrace. He would have been impeached. He would have been the only president ever impeached and removed from office. We know that there have actually been 4 presidents impeached. Andrew Johnson, who was too easy on the South after Lincoln's death. He took over after the Civil War. That's why they impeached him. Nixon, Watergate. Clinton, for lying about cheating on his wife. And then, of course, Trump was impeached twice. None of them were ever expelled, though. Nixon quit because he found out they were going to expel him, and he quit. And then Trump was having to do with, they accused him of trying to convince the Ukrainians to help him win the election in 2020. And then, of course, he was impeached a second time because of what happened on January 6th when there was an attempted coup against the election results that people say that he incited that coup. Attempted insurrection. That just happened. All right, and then we're going to say that Canada was really kind of running right next to the U.S. for a long time. They were industrially the same. They fought in World War II on the side of the Allies. They're always kind of mentioned in the same breath. But Canada felt like the U.S. was starting to get a little too powerful there. And Canada takes a turn to the left. And we're going to see that starting in, I believe, the 60s or 70s, under Prime Minister Trudeau, Canada is going to become much more European-style government, much more left-leaning. They have free healthcare. They have more of a welfare state, where the U.S. is going to turn more to the right, and they're going to try and go back to less government assistance, less government involvement in the economy, and more privatization and private ownership and private companies kind of running things more. Here, no universal health care, less money for poor people. So that was a lot. US and Canada post-World War II.